I heard he's been meeting people in the park so he can ask them to do favors. They say he grants wishes, and if you do him a favor, he'll give you whatever you want. He's been telling people about the Green Man and converting people to his religion. He's a ghost, and he only comes out on Halloween to play pranks on people. He doesn't have a head underneath that pumpkin, and he's trying to steal other people's heads. Travis looked over the notes he had and realized there was likely nothing usable here. Sheriff Carl had advised him to question the younger students about this pumpkin-headed boy, and the reports were as scattered as they were inconsistent. This was indicative of questioning children, but Travis did feel as if he had a few solid leads. He had sussed out the breadcrumbs from the ants, but the crumbs were about as helpful as the actual information. First and foremost, the pumpkin boy did not attend school with them. To their knowledge, he didn't attend school at all, though he had been seen there. He mostly met kids in the park, which was where he recruited them into whatever it was he was doing. Most of them said he took kids into the big hedge to meet them there, but others said it was the old playground behind the new park, where he met with his potential victims. Second was that Pastor Marley had been searching for him too. Most of the kids said that Officer Travis wasn't the first one to ask them about the pumpkin kid. Pastor Marley had become very interested in him and wanted to discover where he could be found. The kids didn't know why he wanted to find the pumpkin kid so badly, but he had been seen haunting many of the same places that the boy had been seen in. Then there were the rumors of the family with the pumpkins for heads as well. They had been wearing them for as long as anyone could remember, and they lived secluded on the outskirts of town. No one had really taken notice of them until now. They were an oddity to be speculated about, but nothing else. Now, there seemed to be some unsettling parallels between them and the ghost boy with the jack-o'-lantern for a head. "Sheriff ain't gonna like it," Gibbs said as he climbed into the passenger seat. Travis shrugged. They had interviewed about 50 kids from grades K to 12, and they had heard a mostly cohesive story. The pumpkin kid was an enigma, a spook, but he was a ghost that others had apparently seen. So, he was either a very convincing bit of urban legend, or he had to be real. Travis wasn't sure which one he liked less. "I doubt he will," he commented as he buckled and started the cruiser. Their police cruiser was an old Crown Victorian that had served in 4 different tours in as many departments. He and Gibbs had named her Trigger, but they were trying to take it as easy on the old girl as possible. As hard as it may be to believe, there weren't a lot of high-speed chases in Frazier, and not a lot of shootouts with drug smugglers or bootleggers either. Trigger had about as quiet a life as her riders, of which they were all glad. "Well, what shall we do?" Gibbs asked. "Well, some of the kids say there's a family of pumpkin heads in town, apparently. You know anything about that? 'Cause it's news to me." Gibbs scratched his head. "I've heard rumors, but most of it's just hearsay. They say Worley delivers groceries out to the old steel place, the farm out behind the Stutter farm, and that he's trucked with the patriarch who wears a pumpkin on his head." "Any truth to it, you think?" Travis asked skeptically. Gibbs just shrugged. "Well, it's a start, I guess. Let's..." But before Travis could answer, the radio crackled to life as dispatch came over the wire. Car 2, come in." Travis looked at the headset, not really wanting to pick it up. It felt like it held ominous portents in that crackle. Gibbs rolled his eyes and picked it up. "Car 2, go ahead, Cheryl." "Be advised, we have a call from the Stutter farm that needs attention." Travis was pulling out into the road, knowing it wouldn't do any good to dilly-dally. 10-4, what's the nature of the disturbance? "Vandalism. No need to run the lights, but Darryl Stutter's pretty upset about the whole thing." Gibbs told her they were on their way and hung up the headset. Travis and his partner were the only 2 officers on duty that day. Sheffield was at a doctor's appointment, and Sheriff Carl was working at the office on paperwork for the upcoming audit. They were spearheading this pumpkin kid investigation, mostly to make sure it wasn't an urban legend, and the more they looked into it, the less and more Travis believed it. "I knew I should have stayed in bed today," Travis growled to himself. "Look on the bright side. At least when we get done as Stutters, we can go check on these pumpkin heads that live at the old steel place." Travis nodded. That was indeed a consolation prize. "Everything was fine when I went to bed last night. Then I come out here today to get them pumpkins ready for the patch tomorrow, and I find this." Darrell Stutter was beside himself as he stood with Travis and Gibbs in his south field, and for good reason. Stutter Farm was one of 5 large farms in the area, and Stutter was known for his pumpkins. Said pumpkins, about 50 in all, though almost 25 were likely damaged beyond salvaging, were now mostly spread across the field. It was a real horror show. Pumpkin innards and orange gourd flesh splattered everywhere, and Travis hated to see it almost as much as the farmer did. This was farmers market country, produce standia, and messing with people's crops was tantamount to murder in their eyes. If Stutter had heard whatever hoodlums had been out there messing with his patch, Travis had little doubt that he'd be coming back to clean up the remains of people, as opposed to produce. "What time would you say you came out to the field, Darrell?" Travis asked, Gibbs looking around for anything they might could use in their report. "Probably about 8, Farmer Stutter said after some thought. "Had to finish with the milking first and hunt up a lost goat, but I reported it no later than 8:30 this morning," he said, and Travis didn't miss the barb. It was nearly noon now, and his pumpkins had been sitting out here waiting for nearly 4 hours. Perhaps the Comet would have something to write about after all. Something about police negligence, Travis was almost certain. "Sorry, Darrell. We've been investigating something else this morning." "Well, that's great. I'm glad my tax dollars don't make me a priority or anything." Travis had to stop himself from rolling his eyes, but it was a near thing. "Let me go see if Officer Gibbs has found anything, and we'll get back with you. In the meantime, we'll file this with the sheriff, so hopefully we can find those responsible and you can get compensated for your pumpkins." "I'll just make myself comfortable by the phone then, shall I?" Farmer Stutter said, stomping into the field as he began searching for salvageable produce. Travis watched him go, really wanting to bounce the notepad he'd been making notes on off the back of the ornery farmer's skull. Instead, he made his way over to Gibbs as he crouched beside something near the fence line. "What you thinking?" Travis asked, pitching his voice low as Darrell skulked nearby. "I think it's a waste of pumpkins," Gibbs said dryly, "but I also suspect that our initial problems might be connected to it." Travis raised an eye. "What, you think kids came out here and did this?" Gibbs nodded. "Yep, sure do." "What do you base that on?" "Well, all them pumpkins looked like they were caved in with bats or maybe crowbars. Something swung one-handed. That being said, their damage isn't real bad. Most of the scatter is because they threw a few of them, not because they whacked them too hard. Whoever hit them wasn't going for RBIs. They just wanted them unusable." "Unusable for what?" Travis asked, but Gibbs only shrugged. "For anything, I reckon." "Uh-huh. Anything else, Columbo?" Travis asked. "Just this." Gibbs was pointing to tracks in the dirt. There were shoe prints in the powdery soil, that was true, but what Travis was looking at was a bike tread. 1 or 2 of them had pushed their bikes through the hole in the pasture fence, the one that made it easy for people to come through when they held the pumpkin patch, and as they followed them back to the road, Travis was unsurprised to find more tracks by the concrete. The tracks headed back into town, or from town, though Travis assumed the trails would be intertwined by now. "Not good," Travis breathed, Gibbs nodding as the two looked back in the direction the tracks were heading. It's shaping up to be the worst week in Fraziers that I've seen in a while." Darrell Stutter rolled his eyes when they said they'd bring their report to the sheriff, saying he hoped the old man would get off his ass and put some effort into this one. Travis, again, resisted the urge to slap the taste out of his mouth and climbed into the car as Gibbs hopped into the shotgun seat. "Shouldn't we be heading back?" Gibbs asked, as they turned left instead of heading into town. "You forget already? We got a date with some pumpkin heads, remember?" "Nothing," Gibbs growled as he slouched back towards the cruiser. "Nothing?" Travis asked, his butt getting warm as he sat on the hood of the cruiser. "Well, not nothing, but no pumpkin heads. There's some animals in the barn, some crops in the little field, but nobody around to tend them, at least not that I've seen." Travis sighed. He might have expected as much. They had pulled up in the little farm, the one that had once been inhabited by a family named Steele back 100 years ago, and found a modest farm with a barn and a small field. They had seen the smoke from the chimney and expected to be greeted at the door, as was the custom, but they had knocked 7 or 8 times to no avail. No one had come out to see what they wanted, or offer them a cold glass of tea, or suggest any sort of vulgar acts that they could accomplish by themselves. Gibbs had gone out to check the barn and the field, while Travis had sat and watched the house. But not a curtain had rustled or a face appeared to peek at them the whole time they were there. Someone lived there, all right. That much was certain, and whoever it was did not like guests. "They must be out," Gibbs said, climbing into the cruiser as he bent down to pick burdocks off his pants cuffs. "We'll just have to come back, I guess." "Yeah," Travis said, though he doubted it would change much. They could come back every day till New Year and still find not a soul. It wasn't until he was putting the cruiser in drive that he looked over and saw what he'd been waiting for. He had to double-take, certain that he had seen the pumpkin head in the small basement window of the farmhouse. But when he looked again, there was nothing but dust. "What's up?" Gibbs asked, looking where he was looking. "See something?" Travis looked for another count of 5 before shaking his head. "Nah, wishful thinking, I guess." He pulled away from the house, but he knew it had been a bit more than his imagination. Travis and Gibbs stood before the desk, waiting for the sheriff's assessment of their findings. They had brought their report to Sheriff Carl, and the old gray-haired cop looked over them with a less-than-pleased eye. Carl Hashwin, the sheriff over the 5 or 6 officers in Fraziers, had once been a lineman for Georgia Tech, but had resigned himself to police work after being passed over by the NFL for the 3rd year in a row. He'd been a decent football player, but as a sheriff, he brought something to the town it had never had. Those who knew Sheriff Carl knew that he wasn't a brute or a big-bellied club swinger like his predecessors. He was an understanding and often slightly progressive community figure, and despite the weight he'd put on in the 10 years that he'd been sheriff, Carl was still capable of exacting change in the hometown that he loved so much. Now, however, he looked troubled. "I don't suppose we have any video evidence that local kids hit Darrell Stutter's pumpkins, do we?" "No, sir. Unfortunately, the bank cameras don't have quite the range for that." Sheriff Carl snorted. "That's good, Parks. You ought to take that up to Grace's on Saturday and see how it flies at the open mic. In the meantime, do either of you have anything concrete we can use to link this?" He held up the report from the Stutter farm. "To this," he said, shaking the folder that contained the other vandalism cases. Travis looked at Gibbs, and the two shared a long look. "Not as such, Sheriff, but it seems pretty convenient that the kids decided to vandalize a bunch of local businesses on the same week that a bunch of pumpkins get busted up. We can prove they rode bikes, which is something a bunch of kids would do, but we don't have anything concrete yet." The sheriff furrowed his brow. looking at the reports again before sighing deeply. "Then you'll have to find some. Show me a link between all of this, and we can begin hunting up perpetrators. Till then, we can't connect the two, and Daryl will just have to mourn the loss of his gored flesh without compensation." Travis sighed, but nodded. He had expected as much. "In the meantime, why not go and talk to the pastor about this pumpkin-headed kid he's interested in? Sounds like he's working the same trail you are, so maybe he's got some information. If one of you thinks you can stake out the park and catch this pumpkin kid making deals with other kids, then be my guest. If this pumpkin boy is the ringleader, then we need to get him out of the equation. What you have is a start, boys, but you need more." Gibbs and Travis left the office a few minutes later, after being dismissed. As the door closed, Gibbs glanced at Travis and grinned as he set his fist into his flattened palm. Rock, paper, scissors to see who's got to go talk to the minister. Travis thought about it, his hand slowly coming up to the ready action. The thought of staking out Rutherford Park in late October, as the first fingers of icy wind came rattling off the plains, was less than exciting, and as they pounded out the start of their first throw, Travis felt the chill of the bursted heater and trigger already. Today, however, the universe decided to be merciful. Gibbs groaned as Travis's paper covered his rock, and Gibbs went off to search the park as Travis left on foot for the Baptist church. It appeared he had a meeting with Pastor Marley. The United Baptist Hall of Fraziers had stood since before Travis was a twinkling in his father's eye, but the white brick building was no less welcoming than it always was as Travis walked up the steps. He stopped before going into the doors, looking at the ghost of a spray-painted message beside them. Had Pastor Marley maybe been having some trouble with vandals too, and forgotten to report it? Travis wondered. It would give him something else to ask, he supposed. It had been a while since he'd been here. Easter service, he supposed, but he remembered the layout from his youth well enough. Pastor Marley was always here, taking up residence inside the living quarters above the church, and when Travis came in, he was replacing candles in the chandelier of the worship hall. He looked very small as he stood on the tall ladder, putting the candle stubs in his pocket as he replaced them with fresh candles from the other. He smiled down at Travis as he came shakily down the great ladder, extending a strong, leathery hand for him to shake. Pastor Marley was pushing 60 if he was a day, but when you shook his hand and felt the pump of his strong arm, you believed the rumors that he'd once been a sergeant in the Marines. "Welcome, my son. What brings you to God's house today?" "Well, sir, I was hoping maybe you could help me with something." Pastor Marley invited him into his study, so they could speak on it privately, and as the white-haired man sat smiling across from him, Travis pulled out his notes. "Doubtless you've heard about the slew of vandalism cases around town." "I have. I, too, have come in for some graffiti, though. I've cleaned it up myself and gone along with my day." "Well, we have reason to believe that a single perpetrator is responsible for these things, and it's an individual you've also been searching for." The pastor nodded, not even attempting to evade the question, which was refreshing for someone in Travis's line of work. "You're talking about the pumpkin-headed child?" Travis nodded. "We've heard you're looking for him, too. Any particular reason why?" The pastor seemed to contemplate the best way to answer the question. "I like to walk in the evenings, officer. My walk often takes me from the church to Rutherford Park, where I sit for a spell before continuing on. It's a nice park. At least it was. A few nights ago, I saw a strange child near the old playground. He was surrounded by other children, and I went to make sure he wasn't being bullied. They had him ringed in, and I feared he might be the subject of their aggression before I got closer. I heard him telling them about someone I hadn't heard spoken of in years, the Green Man. He was also talking about the rewards for following his instructions. I called out to them then, wanting them to move away from the boy so I could talk to him, but when they dispersed, he was already gone. I've been looking for him ever since, hoping to stop him from leading others astray, but I sense that he knows I'm on the prod for him, and he's staying one step ahead of me." Travis was nodding as he made notes. "And what is this Green Man?" "Not what," Marley corrected. "Who. The Green Man is one of those old pagan deities. I heard about him when I was in Germany, something the locals whisper about and make sacrifices to. I'd rather not talk about it. As it turns out, his followers were not as willing to live and let live as mine were. It was a terrible thing, and I still have nightmares about it sometimes. Things like that were part of the reason I left the service and joined the church. I wanted to feel like I was doing something to make things better for people. Turned out I wasn't as strong as I thought I was," he said, looking far away and sad. "And now he's come here?" Travis said, more to himself than anything. "It would seem so," the preacher said. "I'm just trying to do my part to make sure he doesn't corrupt the youth. The youth in this town have so few chances for success, and that kind of environment is a breeding ground for corruption. I'm just trying to keep the lambs on the straight and narrow." Travis snorted. "And they told me that Frazier was too small for gang activity to be an issue. But looks like we have our first turf war after all." The holy man smiled, but there was no real mirth in it. "The entirety of creation is one big turf war between good and evil, Officer Parks. I would think an enforcer of the law would know that better than anyone." Travis took his leave soon after that, making his way on foot to the park. It was just after lunch. Another 5 hours separated him from the free world, and he was hoping for something to take him back to the sheriff before quitting time. Turns out he'd get his wish, and more than he was bargaining for. The old preacher watched him go from the front window. The police had finally taken notice then. That was good. Marley was not a young man, and if the police were willing to take this burden from him, he would give it over happily. He had survived the Green Man once, survived and paid a terrible price for that survival. It had cost him his flock, his church, nearly cost him his faith. He had fled the continent to get away from that old devil, and now it had found him again. Marley shook the thought away. "They'll stop him," he said, hearing his own voice so full of desperate hope. "They'll stop it from happening here." He picked up the bag of trash from his study and moved to the dumpster. He had service tonight, and he still needed to go over the Bible study for the evening. Sometimes, he reflected, it was easier to be a Protestant than it had ever been to be a Catholic. The ceremonies, the pageantry, the rituals, they all got in the way of service sometimes. He had never felt any more holy in his vestments than he had in his polo shirts and suit pants. He was making a difference here in Frazier, and that was fine with him. He had tossed the trash and turned to come back inside when he saw the hateful message on the back of his beloved church. "Your days are numbered, priest. All hail the Green Man." Marley glowered at it for several minutes before turning to the shed to get the paint. This would need to be covered before his flock arrived. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's video. If you still feel like you could do with a little more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that's appearing on your screen? If you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss any of the stories we put on here. I make new videos 7 days a week, and I wouldn't want you to miss a one of them. So if you'd like to support the channel, why not go ahead and subscribe? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the great stuff we do here. And of course, if you'd like to support the channel in a more financial way, you could always become a member on YouTube or on Patreon. Spooky Skeletons, that's my $5 members, always get their videos early, as opposed to in the evening. And we've got lots of other cool stuff that you can take advantage of. Just go down to Patreon and give it a look, or become a member on YouTube. Speaking of all of our wonderful patrons and YouTube members, let's go ahead and thank them right now. Thanks to Unicorn Hollow, our Spooky Ghost contributor. Thanks to our Spooky Skeleton contributors, Janice, Lee Kendall, and Saikat. Thanks to our Ghostly Reader contributors, Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Cinnamon Fox, and Sarah SAMR42. Thanks, guys. We just couldn't do the show without you. Again, if you'd like to support the show in a more monetary fashion, there are links below to Patreon, and you can just go to YouTube and click on membership, if that's something that interests you. There's also links to my latest book below if you'd like to go have a look on Amazon. It should show you the other books I've got as well, so why not go ahead and get the whole collection? And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.